Welcome, and in this episode of the 10-Minute Teacher, what I want to focus on today is our continuing study of theological research and writing, but specifically the use of argument and evidence in your papers. Now, in a previous video, we looked at what it takes to make and write a good paragraph, and the parts of that were really the topic sentence, the supporting sentences in the middle, and then the closing sentences. Now, specifically within the area of support details, there's two key things that it involves. That's the argument itself and the evidence you're going to use to support those arguments. First, let's look at making the argument. As Kate Turabian says, a research argument is like an amiable conversation in which you and your readers reason together to solve a problem. So what I want you to do is view then argument as a conversation with the reader. Get in your mind clearly, who am I writing this paper for? Who is going to read this? And then imagine you're having a conversation with that person, and that's what you're putting down on paper. You're trying to answer these key questions. What do you want me to believe? Why should I believe that? How do you know that's true? What about my ideas on this matter? So those, again, are all the questions the reader is asking, and you're trying to have a conversation and answer them on those key questions they are asking you to resolve. So here's an example conversation that comes from Kate Turabian's book, and I think it gives a good example of maybe the way a normal conversation would look, but how we then can apply that to our paper writing. So person A poses a problem. I hear you had a hard time last semester. How do you think this one will go? Person B responds, better, I hope. A then seeks an answer, why so? Or why, in other words, why do you think that'll be better? B offers a reason, says, I'm taking courses in my major. A is now looking for evidence. There's reason, now they want evidence. Like what? So B offers some evidence. History of art, intro to design. Now A seeks relevance because A doesn't understand the connection between the reason and the evidence. So A asks, why will taking a course in your major make a difference? B offers an argument. When I take courses I'm interested in, I work harder. But now A still has a question about that argument. What about that math course you have to take? B responds with evidence. I know I had to drop it last time I took it, but I found a good tutor. So here again, you can see just in a normal daily conversation how we use reason and evidence and how we interact with that in a casual, normal way to get our point across and to persuade somebody of something important to us. And that's exactly what you're doing with a paper. You're trying to make a persuasive argument. So then, what then is a basic argument, sometimes called a syllogism? It's really composed of three parts. There's the major premise, the minor premise, and a conclusion. Now here's what's important to understand. An argument can have a valid form and still be false. So what I'm really comparing here is this traditional way of looking at argumentation by philosophers and people that would make these things and understanding there's a form and a structure it has to follow. And they say, hey, it can have a valid form or structure, but the results, the answer, the conclusion can still be false. So here in our example, there's a major premise. Blondes have more fun. Then the minor premise, Mary is blonde and Jane is brunette. So the conclusion, Mary has more fun than Jane. So in structure, in form, this is a valid argument. But if we look at the details of each of those components, we see that in reality, the major premise is questionable. It's flawed. There's no way to say in truth that blondes have more fun. Now, it is true that Mary is blonde and Jane is brunette, but what about that conclusion? Mary has more fun than Jane. Well, that might or might not be true, but legitimately you can't make that conclusion based on the argument. So we say that this argument has a valid form, but the claim itself is false. It's unverifiable. Now, a sound argument is both valid in form and true in substance. So here's a major premise. If sinners put their faith in Jesus, they will be saved. There's the minor premise. Mary has placed her faith in Jesus. So what's the conclusion? Mary is saved. Again, looking at all three components, we could say that each one is verifiably true, but there's still a point of doubt. Is that persuasive? Well, to some people who would believe the Bible, that would be persuasive. To other people, it is not persuasive. Even though it is valid in form and it's true, it may not persuade the person listening. So here's the important difference. A persuasive argument is both sound and accepted as sound by the reader. So let's look at this example. A major premise: all mammals are warm-blooded. Minor premise: all black cats are mammals. Conclusion: all black cats are warm-blooded. So here we go. Here's an example where each specific part is true, verifiable, it's sound, the result is truth, and really this would be accepted by pretty much anybody who understood basic science. So it's a very much more persuasive in terms of how many people might buy into that as opposed to the previous argument. So we see the idea of persuasion as important. But there are certainly barriers to making a persuasive argument. So there's cultural barriers, for example. Here's a phrase: it is only fair that women be allowed to enter the workplace. Now, culturally right now, that's a very persuasive type of conclusion. But maybe 50 or 60 years ago in the United States, that would not be persuasive because there were cultural barriers to that. There's also religious barriers to persuasion. Take this sentence, for example: preserving the life of the innocent is our responsibility. Well, again, in our culture today, that's not necessarily acceptable to everybody. That conclusion is not persuasive to many people. But there's also political barriers. For example, this sentence: voting Republican is the only morally right option. Now, certainly there's some people who believe that, and there's others who would not believe that. But there's a political barrier to accepting that, depending on if you're a Christian and a Democrat, or a Christian and an independent, or a Christian and whatever political brand you might label yourself, they would disagree with that. Many Republican Christians would say, yes, that's true. But we can see the ability to persuade people to accepting that is hindered by somebody's political association. So if we take that basic form of argument, the major premise, the minor premise, conclusion, I want to look at two different types of argument. The first is deductive argument. And a deductive argument form uses reason from the general to a more specific statement. It starts with a hypothesis and inserts a fact and comes to a conclusion. And in a deductive argument, certainty is possible. In other words, the conclusion is guaranteed by the simple logic and structure of the form. That is assuming that, of course, the major and minor premise are correct. So here's an example of a deductive argument. There's the major premise: all mammals are warm-blooded animals. There's a minor premise: no lizards are warm-blooded animals. Conclusion: therefore, no lizards are mammals. So you see, this is a true argument in form. It is verifiable and it's truthful in the conclusion, and it's very persuasive. But let's look at another example. Here's the major premise: all humans are mortal. All Greeks are human. Therefore, all Greeks are mortal. Again, valid in form, truthful in content, and very persuasive because it's easy for people to verify from their own experience or reading. But let's look at an example of a deductive form of argument that may not be very persuasive and is probably not even correct. Here's a major premise: Hillary Clinton supports gun control legislation. Minor premise: all fascist regimes of the 20th century have passed gun control legislation. Conclusion: therefore, Hillary Clinton is a fascist. What we have here is a major and minor premise that are true. The form and the structure of this argument are certainly valid, but the conclusion is undoubtedly false. And even if it was a true conclusion, it would be doubtful that that form of argument would get you to that conclusion verifiably. In other words, you'd have to have a better argument to come to that conclusion. So that would not be a very persuasive or accurate argument. All right, with those examples of a deductive argument, now let's look at the inductive. Again, it follows the same basic form or syllogism. There's a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And the inductive form is a little bit different in that reason goes from very specific to the general. It observes facts that lead to a general conclusion, but really no certainty is possible. So it's very different from the deductive argument in those elements. Let's look at an example here. There's a major premise: gravity makes things with weight and mass fall to the ground. Minor premise: I have weight and mass. Conclusion: if I jump off a building, I will fall to the ground. Well, that's a valid inductive argument, and it makes sense. All the components are true, except really the conclusion. That is possibly true, but it's very general and could also be false. Let me give you an example. What if I jump off a building, but there's a trampoline that's underneath me? I would not hit the ground. What if I jump off the building and I'm swooped up by a giant pterodactyl? Okay, maybe not very, very realistic and could happen, but the trampoline one certainly could. Either way, that conclusion is rational. It makes sense. It's a good argument. And the conclusion is not wrong, but it's not necessarily knowable with 100% certainty. Let's look at another one. There's a major premise. The global climate is changing. Minor premise. Man-made carbon emissions impact the environment. The conclusion, mankind is causing global climate change. So here again, we're left with an argument where certainly the major and minor premise are true. The global climate is changing. It's always changed. So change has been a part of the earth since we've had ice ages till now. No one can doubt that carbon emissions do impact the environment and change things. But here's where we run into the problem, the conclusion. Mankind is therefore causing global climate change. We've taken two true statements, come to a general conclusion, but it's certainly not the only possible answer. There could be other factors, other influences there. So this is a valid inductive argument, and the truthfulness of that is certainly not possible, at least from the evidence given here within this statement. Here's one final example. Major premise, all Christians believe in God. Minor premise, all Muslims believe in God. Conclusion, therefore, all Christians are Muslims. So here again, we have valid major and minor premise, but the conclusion is clearly false. We know it to be false. However, keep in mind, the form of the argument itself is valid. It's just not true in the conclusion, and therefore is not very persuasive to anybody who understands the differences between these two religions. However, again, it's a very general conclusion. There are some people who would view this as the same thing. There are people who have cultural perceptions as opposed to religious ones that would say, yes, that's a valid argument from their perspective. So what's key in all this is to avoid flawed arguments. And while I don't have a chance to go into all of these, here's a few common names for flawed arguments. There's ad hominem, ambiguity, appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, straw man, bandwagon, begging the question, black and white, false cause, middle ground, slippery slope, special pleading. And this isn't a logic course, but to understand the flaws in these arguments and how, one, you can avoid them, but two, just to discern them in your daily life is a great thing to be able to do. So I'd encourage you to look these up, do some exploration, and make sure you understand how to avoid these flaws. So once you have argument, the next key step is providing evidence. So again, looking at Kay Turabian, she says this: the core of your argument is your claim, that's your thesis statement, supported by your reason or argument for believing it and the evidence that grounds those reasons. So how does this look in the paper? Well, here's a few things to be aware of. The major premise is really your main thesis statement of the paper. That's what you've written. You've started. What's my thesis? What's the argument that I'm going to make, or the conclusion I'm trying to reinforce through the argumentation of this paper? Where am I going with this? The minor premise is really each section of your paper. So the minor premise isn't just one simple sentence. It could be pages and pages, multiple sections of information. That's really where you're presenting your minor premise. And then your conclusion. That's the summation of all the arguments and evidences that you've given and whether or not they support your major premise or your thesis. So that's how all of this works together in the context of writing a paper. So let's then look quickly at argument versus evidence to make sure you understand what is the difference between these two. Well, in this case, evidence is collected or discovered. That's the research process. An argument, by contrast, is thought out or created by you, the researcher. Evidence is a foundation for the argument. So evidence is going to provide the foundation for you to make this argument. That's what you're going to support or buttress or build your argument from. And of course, then the argument by definition then is built upon the evidence you've provided. In the evidence, you're going to have to cite a source. You're going to have to tell readers where this came from. And then the argument itself really doesn't have to be cited. The researcher is really the source. Now, the only exception for footnoting or citation is that if you are borrowing the argument, the thought from somewhere else, somewhere you were inspired to make this argument, certainly you want to make reference to that and give the proper footnote or citation for that. All right, so what are some types of evidence you might encounter? Well, there's scientific evidence, things that are observable, demonstrable, and repeatable. That's what good science is all about. There's legal or historical evidence, both very much the same. They're investigated, They look at material or forensic evidence, their documentary evidence, and testimonial evidence. So all of those really fall within the category of legal or historical evidences. Then there's statistical evidence, which is really numerical data or researchable type evidence. And there's revelatory evidence. Now, especially within the area of theological research, we understand that the scripture is a source of revelation from God. Now, it gives eyewitness testimony and other things that are involved, but it also provides us with a direct revelation of God himself through man that we believe has authority for our life and which does have authority in our life. So that revelatory evidence is external and ultimate authority in our lives as we as Christians see the scripture. And these are all types of evidence that you can use and incorporate in making your argument. But there's a lot of problems with evidence. It could be outdated, uncorroborated, inaccurate, insufficient, too narrow, too broad. It could be irrelevant. It could be easily debunked or has already been debunked in the past and you're using bad evidence. You lack standing with the reader. Now, this is a problem with you yourself, not the evidence, but the reader says, hey, you don't have the authority to bring this evidence, or they don't trust you to bring the evidence. You lack understanding of the evidence, and you don't demonstrate a proper understanding in making your argument, or your presentation is just plain boring. Again, the goal is persuasive argument, and nobody is persuaded by boring stuff. So you have to be interesting in the way you present so that you don't bore your reader to death and they actually finish reading your work. Now, here's one example that we could look at. Again, let me remind you, we had the topic sentence, supporting details, which includes the argument and evidence, and a closing sentence. And we've talked in other videos, as I've presented ideas, on the idea of circumcision in the Old Testament. Now, let's take this simple paragraph that comes from the Encyclopedia of the Bible. And we're going to look at each of these four parts: the topic sentence, the supporting argument, supporting evidence, and the closing. So here's our topic. The rite of circumcision is far older than the Hebrew people. And there's two sentences that are used as supporting argument. One, Israel adapted the rite of circumcision from the practice of the surrounding nations. And two, the Hebrews were the only ancient practitioners of circumcision to observe the rite in infancy, thus freeing it from the association with fertility rituals. So now here's the question for you to kind of examine and respond to. Which of these arguments is the weakest and why? What would be your reasons for saying one of these two is the weaker of the arguments? Now, the next part of this paragraph gives really three supporting evidences. The first is cave paintings give evidence that it was practiced in prehistoric times. The Egyptian temple drawings show that the operation of circumcision was common in 4000 BC and probably earlier. And the third supporting evidence is this: peoples practicing circumcision lived in almost every other continent. So again, answer this question. In your view, which of these evidences is the weakest? And here we have our closing. Outside of Judaism, the procedure no longer carries religious significance. So in your view then, what's wrong with this closing? Is it persuasive or is it not persuasive? Why? What would keep it from persuading you? All right, that's it for our discussion on argument and evidence. Now head to the library and continue to research.